We were talking about LM curve, how it shows all combinations of interest rate and output for which our financial market is in equilibrium. Now, when deriving LM curve, we need to decide how do we characterize monetary policy because we need to consider two alternative options. The central bank can either follow a fixed money supply policy, where it chooses the money supply and keeps it constant at the chosen level, while letting the interest rate adjust to clear the money market given its choice of M. Right? So given its choice of M, it will allow the interest rate to adjust to maintain money market equilibrium. The alternative is to follow a fixed interest rate or constant interest rate target, where the central bank chooses the interest rate and keeps it constant at the chosen level by adjusting the money supply. So whenever we're driving the LM curve, we need to consider two alternative policy options. One is the fixed money supply policy, where you choose the money supply, keep it constant, and let the interest rate adjust to maintain equilibrium in the money market for its chosen level. Alternatively, you can follow a fixed interest rate policy where you choose the interest rate and keep it constant at the chosen level by adjusting the money supply. So you have to choose whether you want to target the interest rate, keep that constant, or target the money supply, I keep that constant. So now, historically, when the LM curve was derived, it was assumed that the central bank follows a fixed money supply policy, where it chooses the money supply M and lets the interest rate adjust to maintain equilibrium given its choice of M, where money demand is equal to the given money supply M. So in such a scenario, if income were to increase, we know that would increase money demand. Then in that case, since the money supply is fixed, to maintain money market equilibrium, interest rate would increase, right? Because like we said, when we're assuming fixed money supply policy, what adjusts to maintain equilibrium is interest rate. So if income increases, money demand increases, and you're following a fixed money supply policy, money supply is fixed, then interest rate has to increase to maintain financial market equilibrium. So in other words, for a given money supply, an increase in income automatically leads to an increase in interest rate. So this gave us a traditional upward sloping LM curve, where we start off with one interest rate income combination. And then what happens is income increases, that increases money demand. And since we have a fixed money supply policy, so what increases to restore equilibrium is the interest rate. So the increase in income is associated with an increase in interest rate to maintain equilibrium. So we get a traditional upward sloping LM curve. Because like we said, in this scenario, when the money supply is kept constant, so what adjusts to clear money market is the interest rate. So as income increases, money demand increases. For a given fixed money supply, interest rate increases to restore equilibrium, giving us a traditional upward sloping LM curve. But modern central banks don't start with how much will be the money supply. Rather, they choose the interest rate, say I bar, at which they want the money market to clear. And then they adjust the money supply to ensure this I bar is where the money market clears. Because obviously this interest rate that they're choosing has to be consistent with equilibrium in the money market. Otherwise, there'll be pressure on it to increase or decrease, right? Because if this is not the equilibrium interest rate in the money market, then there will be pressure on it to change. So basically the idea is that the central bank, what modern central banks do is they choose the interest rate at which they want the money market to clear, and they keep that interest rate constant, consistent with equilibrium in the money market by adjusting money supply to ensure the money supply curve intersects the money demand curve at the target interest rate I bar. So what modern central banks do is they, instead of fixing the money supply, they choose the interest rate at which they want the money market to clear and keep it constant at the chosen level by adjusting the money supply. So under the assumption, the central bank chooses the interest rate and adjusts the money supply to achieve it. The LM curve is a horizontal line at the central bank's chosen interest rate. Regardless of whatever the income level is, the central bank wants to keep I constant, for which it adjusts the money supply endogenously to keep I at I bar, regardless of whatever Y is, whether Y is Y1, whether Y is Y2. The central bank will ensure the money market clears at I bar by adjusting the money supply. Let's look at this diagrammatically what this means. So consider the money market diagram below with initial equilibrium at point A and interest rate I. Suppose output increases from Y to Y prime, and that increases money demand from MD to MD prime. Now, if the central bank does not change the money supply, it follows a fixed money supply policy. The money supply is fixed at MS. So if we started off at A, money demand increased, we're not changing the money supply, we're following a fixed money supply policy. So then the equilibrium will move from A to B, and the interest rate will increase from IA to IB, resulting in an upward sloping LM curve. We initially had this point IAY, and then Y increased to Y prime. And the central bank, in this case, did not change the money supply. So to maintain money market equilibrium, interest rate increased from IA to IB. Right, so now we initially had this point IAY, now we have a new point IB Y prime. So we get this upward sloping LM curve under a fixed money supply policy. Because you start at A, income increases, money demand increases. You keep the money supply fixed. So as a result, to maintain money market equilibrium, interest rate increases. So we move from A to B. So we have this initial point A, we have a new point B with a higher income and as well as higher interest rate. So we get an upward sloping LM curve. However, if the central bank wanted to maintain the interest rate at IA, it wanted to follow a fixed interest rate policy. So to keep the interest rate at IA, once income increases and money demand increases, the central bank would have to increase the money supply from MS to MS prime to keep the interest rate at IA, right? Because if it did not, there would be pressure on the interest rate to increase, like we saw in the case of fixed money supply policy. So to keep the interest rate at IA, the central bank increases the money supply from MS to MS prime to accommodate the increase in money demand, and that moves the equilibrium from point A to point C, resulting in a horizontal LM curve. Because initially you started off with output Y and interest rate IA. Even though output went up to Y prime, which increased money demand, but the central bank increased the money supply to keep interest rate constant at IA. So regardless of the level of Y, like we said, the interest rate is kept constant at IA, giving us a horizontal LM curve. Right, so when we have an upward sloping LM curve under fixed money supply policy, but we have a horizontal LM curve under fixed interest rate policy. In short, Y increases, that increases money demand, regardless of whether it's upward sloping or horizontal LM curve. In the case of upward sloping LM curve, as Y increases, money demand increases, interest rate increases. Right, the central bank is following a fixed money supply policy. So when Y increases, money demand increases, interest rate increases for a given money supply. So we get the upward sloping LM curve. But in the case of horizontal LM curve, when Y increases, money demand increases, the central bank increases the money supply to keep I constant, giving us a horizontal LM curve. So the idea over here is we get an upward sloping LM curve under fixed money supply policy. We get a horizontal LM curve under fixed interest rate policy. Both show us combinations of interest rate and output for which financial market is in equilibrium. They do so under different policy assumptions. One is assuming a fixed money supply policy. One is assuming a fixed interest rate policy.